Hello everyone, welcome to Talking History, brand new channel, very first video. I thought new year, new channel. How far into January can I say new year? Anyway, my name's Liz, and as I said, this is Talking History, and my aim for this channel is to do exactly as it's called, Talk History. I am not an historian, please don't come at me. I'm just someone who is very passionate about history, and I thought I would share my passion with all of you. And a little bit about me, my particular favourite era is the Tudors. Anything and everything to do with the Tudors, I love it, especially the man himself, Henry VIII. I know he's a little bit like Marmite, we either love him or you hate him. I loved him, even though he was a bully and he was a brute and he had Anne Boleyn killed. But he was a extremely fascinating character, and the whole era was just so fascinating you couldn't actually make it up. And I have quite a few ideas for future videos, so if you like what you see at the end of this video, please stick around. And I thought, as I said, very first video, why don't we go all the way back to Alfred the Great? So make yourselves comfortable, grab a drink as we step back in time and let Alfred tell his story. Alfred was born in the year 849. He was born in Wantage in Berkshire. And he was born to parents Ethelwulf and Osberg. And Ethelwulf was the King of Wessex, which is where we are. And at this time, England is extremely different to as we know it is today. England was actually split up into 7 different kingdoms. So as I said, you had Wessex. You also had Kent, Essex, Sussex, Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia. And Wessex, it covered Hampshire, Dorset, Wiltshire, Somerset. And when it expanded, it eventually went on to cover Devon and Cornwall. Alfred was the youngest of 5 boys, and he also had a younger sister. Alfred's older brothers were Ethelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert and Ethelred. I hope I pronounced those right. You're going to have to forgive my pronunciations, they didn't make it easy. And his younger sister was Ethelswith, who would become known as Queen of Mercia, and she has such a fascinating story to tell in her own right, and I would love to do a video on her. Unfortunately, we don't know an awful lot about Alfred's mother, Osberg. During her time in the 9th century and Anglo-Saxons, the role of a queen was really quite limited. A role of a wife. Anglo-Saxons didn't like their wives being known as queens until Ethelwulf. Ethelswith. Ethelwulf's the dad. So everything we know about Alfred, we can be thankful to Bishop Asser, who was a friend of Alfred's, and he lived during Alfred's time, obviously, and he wrote a biography on Alfred. And in this, there is a really lovely story about a time when Osberg had all of her children around her, and she sat them down and she brought out this big, beautiful book on English poetry. And the moment Alfred saw this book, he was instantly fascinated. So Osper sent her children a little challenge. She basically said the first one who could go away, learn and recite the poems back to her would be given the book as a prize. Alfred, probably not yet being able to read, he was read the poems probably by a tutor, and he went back to his mother and he recited the poems to her, and she gave him the book as a little prize. Obviously there's no evidence at all to suggest that this ever happened, but it's just a really lovely story. But it's also a really good insight into the Anglo-Saxon home and the importance of learning and books. And it's also quite possible that it was this moment that ignited the spark for Alfred's love of learning. And it's also shortly after this story that any record of Osper just completely disappears. So we can only assume that she must have died sometime after. There's also no set evidence of what kind of education that Alfred would have received. Asser stated that he didn't learn to read until he was 12 years old. But it's also quite probable, is that a word? Probable? Possible? Probable? That he received an education of that in military, which would have been quite normal for a young man of his rank. So Alfred's first appearance in active service was in 868 when he was 19. He and his brother Ethelred was called to help Bugred of Mercia when a very large Viking army landed in East Anglia in 865. They took possession of East Anglia and then they moved on to Northumbria by 867, which they also took possession of, and then they moved on to Mercia in 868. And as I said, all of the kingdoms had their own kings. So when the Vikings took possession of these kingdoms, the kings were either tortured to death or they fled. And Alfred and his brother was in Mercia for quite some time, and it's here that he met and fell in love and married a Mercian noblewoman by the name of Ellsworth. And they married in Sutton, and it's believed that shortly after the wedding, Alfred fell ill with some kind of intestine stomach condition, which actually remained with him for the rest of his life. So by 870, the Vikings had taken control of 6 out of the 7 kingdoms. I don't want to do an awful lot on the Vikings, mainly because I find the Vikings a little bit like a rabbit's den. The moment you go down the rabbit hole, it's hard to get back out. So I just want to more stick to around Alfred's defeat, if it were, of the Vikings. So, as I said, they took possession out of the 6 of 7 kingdoms, and that was until they attacked the very last kingdom, which was Wessex. And Wessex at this time was in joint commandership of Alfred and his brother Ethelred. And Ethelred had deposed of his father when his father had returned from a year-long pilgrimage tour of Rome. And this was in 856. But Ethelwulf, they continued to rule Kent and some other eastern provinces until his death, which was in 858. So by late 871, at the Battle of Ashdown, Ethelred was killed and the Vikings took control of the last kingdom. Alfred, who was only 21, was now king of this fallen kingdom. Ethelred did actually have children. He had 2 young boys, but they was too young to rule. So that's why it fell to Alfred. By 878, the Vikings, that was at the time led by King Guthrum, had seized Chippenham in Wiltshire, and they used this as a secure base where they completely devastated Wessex. The locals either escaped or they escaped to Isle of Wight, or they surrendered. Alfred and a few noblemen withdrew to the Somerset marshes, and it's quite possible that Alfred knew the area when he was younger, when he used to go hunting. And this is where the story of the burning cakes comes in. So Alfred had sought refuge from a farmer's wife, and she was very polite. She let him in, and she had been busy in the kitchen baking cakes. So she lets him in, he comes in, and she said, "Oh, I gotta go off and do some other little things. Just keep an eye on my cakes. Don't let them burn." He went, "Yes, thank you for letting me come in. Thank you." No. And obviously he had a lot on his mind. He was preoccupied. He got distracted, and the cakes burned. So the peasant woman comes back in, sees the cakes all burnt, and she gives him a white little walloping. She tells him off. "I let you into my house. I let you into my kitchen. All you had to do was look after me cakes, and you let them burn. Who do you think you are?" And all this, giving the king a white old telling off. And it didn't happen. The very first mention of any cakes burning wasn't until the 12th century. But a lot of people, a lot of historians, has read into this story of the burning cakes that the cakes was Alfred's people. The cakes was Wessex. He let them down. He let them burn. And it was at this point, bearing in mind, going back, the Vikings had keep coming back and forth, ever since the 7th century, late 7th century they started. So 850, maybe later than that. Like I say, it's a rabbit warren. Once you go in, you can't get out. So they kept coming back year after year, taking money, destroying monasteries, then going off. And they thought, "Oh, I'm bored again. Let's go back." So Alfred's father hadn't done anything different. He just paid them off and off they went. And his brothers hadn't done anything different either. So Alfred decided to change tactics. He thought, "Why am I think like a Viking? If they can do it, why can't I?" So he adapted the Danes' tactics. He had a fortified base built in Athenry in Somerset, and he summoned a mobile army of men from Somerset, Wiltshire, Hampshire, and guerrilla warfare was pursued against the Vikings. And in May 878, the Danes were defeated at the Battle of Edington, and Alfred's hard work had paid off. There was no more burning cakes now. Asser had wrote in Alfred's biography, Alfred attacked the whole pagan army, fighting ferociously in dense order, and with divine will eventually won the victory. He made great slaughter against them, among them, and pursued them to their fortress, which is in Chippenham. And after 14 days, the pagans were brought to the extreme depths of despair by hunger, cold, and fear, and they sought peace. So the victory was a turning point for Wessex, and it was their battle for survival. So instead of driving the Vikings out, paying them off, and just going, yeah, see you later, I'll come back next year, instead he seeks peace with them. So King Guthrum was pretty much forced to convert to Christianity, and Alfred was leader, godfather if you were. And many of the Danes returned to East Anglia and they settled as farmers. So Alfred had a treaty negotiated in 886, and basically saying that the northern and eastern parts of England came under the jurisdiction of the Danes, which would become known as Danes' Law. Alfred gained control of the areas the Vikings had captured, as most now considered Alfred as king. Alfred had also arranged a marriage of his eldest daughter to the Lord of the Mercians, Ethelred. Not like his brother Ethelred, different one. And they sealed the alliance against the Danes. And Ethelfled, who was Alfred's daughter, would become known as Lady of Mercia. It starts getting a little bit confusing with all the names coming out, and they all are very, very similar. But I will try to do videos on Alfred's sister, which was Ethelthwith, and Alfred's daughter, which is Ethelfled. Please bear with me. So Alfred had also arranged a marriage with his youngest daughter, Ethelthwith, who was also known as Elfrida. I think I'm pronouncing that right. To Baldwin II, also known as the Bold, and the Count of Flanders. And this alliance was founded on their common interest of preventing the Vikings from settling along the coast. Ethelthwith, or Elfrida, is an ancestor of Matilda of Flanders, who went on to marry William the Conqueror, which started the Anglo-Norman, the Anglo-Norman lines of the kings of England. So this meant through the birth of Henry I, Ethelthryth is a direct ancestor to Queen Elizabeth II. I hope I've made sense of that. And if you're anything like me, my mind's just gone. I just find it so fascinating that her heritage goes all the way back. How amazing is that? So obviously Alfred had done all of this, and he was still fully aware that a threat of more Vikings attacks, it did remain. And more Viking attacks did happen, but they were defeated. So Alfred organised an army to be put on a rota basis. So basically one on, one off, one on, one off, which he called a rapid reaction force. So this basically meant an army could be raised against raiders, and he still had men to tend the farms, as you had the one on, one off, one on, one off. Alfred had also had settlements, defence settlements built across southern England after he gained control of London. These settlements, or burhs, or fortified marketplaces, they basically meant that settlers received plots of land, and in return they manned the defence system in times of war. And these plots, they shaped the street plan in London that's still in place, that still exists today, between Cheapside and the Thames. So he also, as I said, he built these network of burhs at strong points, which basically centred around Alfred's royal court in Winchester on the main river routes. So this basically meant that in times of war, there was no part of Wessex that was left undefended. Every 20 miles was one of these settlements, defence camps, if it were. So no matter which part of Wessex you were in, if you were suddenly attacked, within 20 miles you had refuge. I hope I've made sense of that. I know it's a little bit, can't get my head around it. Bear with me. So Alfred also had some ships built. These were the long 60-oar manned ships. And because he was fully aware that the Vikings used the sea as basically their motorway. If you're in America, it's highway, but you know. So basically it is their way to get in and out, in and out. And he had these high-sided 60-oar ships built to defend the coast, defend the seas from more Danish invaders. A little bit about these ships. I imagine we've all seen them in the films, you know, when you've seen all the old films, you've seen them when they're all there and all. But the Sutton Hoo, is it Sutton Hoo? Yeah. There's the film on Netflix called The Dig, And it's basically about the amateur archaeologist Basil Brown, something like that. Anyway, it's about the archaeology discovery of the medieval ship, and it was 89 feet long, something. So that's the kind of ship. Anyway, back to it. So, as I said, Alfred hadn't learned to read until he was 12 years old, but he did have a love of learning. So this was where, now he'd done all of his protecting the country, he'd got that sorted, he got his army sorted. So now he thought it was a time to get an education system going, because he realised that it lacked. Especially after, as I said, the Vikings had come in and destroyed the monasteries. So he thought it was time to get learning on. So Alfred had arranged, and he also took part in translating books from Latin into Anglo-Saxon, or Old English. And this meant that those who could read English would be able to read to those who couldn't read. So this basically meant everyone learned, whether you was literate or not. And these books covered history, geography, philosophy. There was also a book for bishops, Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, and that was sent out to all the bishops across the kingdom. And it's through Alfred's love of learning he developed the education system. So he had books made more accessible. He introduced court schools, providing an education, but he made it for everyone and not just those of nobility. So those of a lesser status could also learn. And he made sure that the best tutors taught at these schools. And Alfred also had the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle commissioned, which he was the patron saint of. And this chronicle was a document that prompted the unification of England at the time. And the chronicle actually continued to be copied and issued and sent out until 1154. And this chronicle, it's allowed us to learn so much about the Anglo-Saxon period and their way of life. Alfred had also established his own legal code, the laws of King Alfred. So much like his brothers and his father before him, they all had their own legal code. So Alfred had developed his own. This legal code was written sometime between 880 and 899. And according to Asser, Alfred took great interest in making and reviewing these laws. Alfred's laws consisted of 43 laws. I'm not gonna go through all 43 laws. We'll be here for a hell of a long time. But they included treason, stealing from a church, fighting in the king's great hall, and fornication with a nun. Naughty boy. Alfred had also reformed the coinage and had the minting of coins extended to the boroughs that he had founded. So he was now being referred to as King of the English. And Welsh kings, which Asa was also Welsh, they were seeking alliances with Alfred. So Alfred had reformed, he had redeveloped, and he had improved England as it was under his reign. He found a way to maintain peace during extremely uncertain times. And Alfred reigned for 29 years. Alfred died on the 26th of October, 899, aged 50. His death was from unknown causes, but now looking back at his conditions and the symptoms he was showing, a lot of historians and medical historians believe that it could have been from Crohn's disease. During Alfred's reign, actually no, I want to go back to Alfred's death a little bit. Alfred was buried in the Old Minster at Winchester. And on the completion of the new Minster, a few years later, Alfred's remains was transferred there. During the reign of Henry I, in the 12th century, Henry had wanted to extend his palace, so he had the new Minster demolished. So Alfred's remains, along with his sons Edward the Elder and quite possibly his brothers Ethelwulf's Allfather's remains, they were moved to a new build monastery outside the city walls where they could accommodate them. During Henry VIII's reign, during the dissolution of the monasteries, Alfred and his son's remains, which was at near the front of the high altar in Hyde Abbey, they was disturbed again and the abbey was destroyed. So this led to a mystery over their remains. But according to another story, their graves were not disturbed during Henry VIII's reign, but they were in fact unearthed during the construction of a town jail in 1788. And the bones were brought by a vicar. And however, after recent, I don't know how recent, probably a few years back, radiocarbon dating the contents, it indicated that these bones were in fact from the 14th century. So after this, there was obviously disappointment, but then a box of remains that was kept in storage caught the attention of some archaeologists, and these were kept at the Winchester City Museum. So these bones, which had been brought from Hyde Abbey in the 1990s, And after radiocarbon dating these, there was a fragment of a pelvic bone. The archaeologists had confirmed that it was very likely that this pelvic bone fragment was in fact that of either Alfred the Great, Edward the Elder, or Ethelred, all of which were buried at the abbey, and it's believed that this bone fragment belonged to an adult male aged between 26 and 45 and had died between 895 and 1017. So whoever these bones belonged to, they had originally been laid to rest near the high altar in the abbey, and this was a very prestigious position. So basically meaning it could have been that of a king. So during Alfred's reign, he was never referred to as Alfred the Great. During his whole lifetime, he was just King Alfred. He didn't become known as Alfred the Great until around the 16th century, when good old Henry VIII referred to him as Alfred the Great. Apparently, I do love this story. Apparently, Henry wanted to become known as Harry the Great, but it never quite took off. I don't know why. Poor Henry. Alfred was succeeded by his eldest son, who was Edward the Elder, and Edward had extended his rule, and he conquered areas that had previously been held by the Danes. But he hadn't conquered all of England. That would be his son, Ethelstan, who would become the very first king of all England. And I have a video planned for him in the next couple of weeks. I thought at the end of every video, I would leave you with some words from who we are talking about in that video. And obviously today, Alfred the Great, I would like to leave this video with some words from the man himself. All the youth in England of free man who are rich enough to be able to devote themselves to it, be set to learn as long as they are not fit for any other occupation, until they are able to read English writing well. I think that sums up Alfred the Great, don't you? Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave comments down below. Please be kind. We have had a rough couple of years. There's no need to be nasty. Look after yourselves. Please look after yourselves. I'll see you all next time.